A funeral in Bilbao, northern Spain. The final act of another murder in the Basque country. The victim was a policeman, gunned down in the street by the extremists of ETA. It's an example of the terrorist violence that last month persuaded Spain's armed forces to intervene in Spanish politics, to attempt a takeover in the interests of law and order. But what's remarkable about this killing is that it happened 2 weeks after the abortive coup, and a week after millions of Spaniards demonstrated in support of a free, democratic state. In the eyes of many Spanish politicians and military men, this funeral is a symbol of the failure of that system, and a warning it could be just a matter of time before Europe's newest democracy is overthrown, to be replaced by what in Spain they call dictadura blanda, benign dictatorship. A week is a very long time in Spanish politics, particularly if it happens to be Carnival Week in Madrid. It's a time to take full advantage of the freedoms that democracy has brought to Spanish society, a celebration that these people have thrown off the yoke of repression and authoritarian rule. Yet just a week before, democracy nearly died in Spain. At 5:25 p.m. on Monday the 23rd of February, a detachment of the Guardia Civil, Spain's paramilitary police force, under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Antonio Tejero, invaded the Spanish parliament, the Cortes. The 300 arrested deputies looked on with a mixture of fear and disbelief.
That rather striking and at the same time rather unreal picture of the colonel with a three-cornered heart on the dais of parliament, shooting and shouting at the same time, rather belongs to a rather forgettable past.
Well, of course, along 18 hours of being arrested, quotation marks, well, you can imagine that the feelings were very mixed. We had time to think about the past, the present, and the future.
People are now saying, why was Tejero able to march in there? He should have been in a lunatic asylum. That is the public opinion in Madrid. How come a maniac was allowed to walk the streets?
The idea that the army was coming back, that the Franco's time were returning, all those feelings, of course, were in my mind, and I think in the minds of all the parliamentarians that were that night in the parliament.
The spectre of past repression rose in the minds of people throughout Spain. Thousands rushed home early from work to get more details of what they believed at the time was a full-scale military coup d'etat. But news on the state broadcasting service stopped, replaced by light music. Rumours spread of curfew and what form the new government would take. Members of radical and left-wing political groups feared that once again they'd be outlawed by an authoritarian regime. By 7 o'clock, Antonio de Paz, who considers himself a liberal, was laying plans to escape to safety.
I have also another friend who has a little villa on the mountains, and then we thought about the idea to go there with my wife and my little daughter, and stay there some days waiting the news, then to cross by the country to Portugal.
Why would you have left the country?
It would be too easy for them to take in everybody who was associated of left party or to a syndicate, and to put it on the jails, really. And after that, we don't know what will happen. And so we thought of the idea of going out from the country.
In homes all over Spain, families tuned their radios to foreign stations in an attempt to get more accurate details of what was happening to their country. Spanish television was showing the feature film The Princess and the Pirate. Then, at 1:15 in the morning, the king broadcast to the nation.
Ante la situación creada por los sucesos desarrollados en el Palacio del Congreso, y para evitar cualquier posible confusión,
he told them the crisis had passed. Most military units had obeyed him as their commander-in-chief and remained in barracks. Only in Valencia had the tanks appeared on the streets, commanded by a well-known extremist, General Milan del Bosch. He and other ringleaders had been arrested. What appeared to be a badly organized adventure, a comic opera of a coup, had played itself out.
Más fuertes, toda la zona baja de la carrera de San Jerónimo, la zona que linda con la plaza de Neptuno, está aplaudiendo, la gente gritando. Parece que sí, ahí vemos ya que se acerca.
People of cosmopolitan Spain took to the streets to shout for democracy. More than 1 million of them in Madrid alone. The king was the hero of the day. Spain's extreme right-wing newspaper, El Alcazar, the Fortress, protested the demonstrations were inspired by Marxists. But in front of the cameras, the leaders of communist and Catholic political parties shook hands for the first time in years, united by the euphoria of having frustrated the powers of fascism. That euphoria was misplaced. There was already evidence that the attempted coup had drawn support from deep inside Spain's military establishment. General Alfonso Armada, deputy chief of the General Staff and one of the king's closest advisors, was himself involved. It had become clear that this was no enterprise of the lunatic fringe. Indeed, what was seen on that February evening had been no more than a ripple on the surface of a sink of military discontent. None of this should have come as any surprise. The night before the attempted coup, El Alcazar, the newspaper that concerned itself with military interests, even hinted that a takeover was imminent. By a photograph of the empty chamber of the Cortes, they printed, "Everything is ready for tomorrow's session." Senior officers in the army and Guardia Civil had been touting their views in public for months, warning of what would happen if democracy ran its course and the armed forces had their status eroded. When restrictions were put on officers dabbling directly in politics, they found a ready supply of civilian spokesmen. Retired officers like General Prieto, a fervent supporter of Franco, the old order, and military prestige.
El ejército, económicamente, estaba peor con Franco, pero sin embargo...
Under Franco, the military were financially worse off, but then they were not persecuted, shot down from the back and killed in the street and then buried in secret. Editors of newspapers should be more intent on not antagonizing the army, because the final reality is that it is the army that carries the guns. This is all the more so because the democracy has not yet been consolidated in Spain, and the army, after being used to so much respect for so many years under Franco and having been ill-treated by the recent government, does not view democracy as it might do in 5 years' time.
Does the army support democracy?
¿El ejército apoya la democracia?
Estoy plenamente convencido que a una democracia con autoridad, una democracia...
I'm absolutely convinced it does support a democracy, but a democracy with authority, a democracy like the English, the German or the French.
So why do some sections of the army take action such as we saw on the 23rd of February?
Primero interpreto que una minoría tan pequeña no puede ser la representación.
Such a minority cannot be representative of a collective whole. An army that does not have power can nevertheless not allow that people should mistreat it, as have the successive centrist governments, and as the opposition continues to do so and persecuting it.
Y eso permite que erróneamente pueda interpretarse que el ejército es enemigo de la democracia.
And that is how you could erroneously suppose that the army were an enemy of a democracy, which it is not.
Military discontent had been nurtured in the corners of army barracks since the 20th of November 1975. General Franco, who had ruled supreme for almost 40 years, died, and the throne of Spain passed to his chosen successor.
En nombre de las Cortes Españolas y del Consejo del Reino, manifestamos a la nación española que queda proclamado Rey de España, Don Juan Carlos de Borbón y Borbón.
The coronation of Juan Carlos I, King of Spain, leader of the armed forces, and the man who would guide his nation from the system Franco described as organic democracy to democracy without adjectives.
En el recuerdo a Franco, ¡viva el rey! ¡Viva! ¡Viva España! ¡Viva!
The army watched and waited. Last month, they could wait no longer. Their plans were laid. They had been for months. But they made one serious miscalculation. They counted on the support of the king. In the event, he remained firm on the side of democracy. There are sections of the armed forces who will never forgive him for that. To watch and listen to the army on parade in Madrid, you could easily come to the conclusion they're a less than disciplined force. It's now a conscript army, slightly scruffy, squaddies smoking as they march, chatting to passers-by, even listening to transistor radios. But the officer corps is a different matter, and not just in the ranks of the colonels and generals who still remember the heroic deeds of the Civil War. At their academy at Saragossa, today's young officers are taught to believe that they alone are the guardians of Spain. For the last 60 years, they've to all intents and purposes been its masters. Even now, when sections of the army and Guardia Civil have proved without question their disloyalty to king and constitution, there's an inbuilt reluctance in Spain to expose them to censure. The leaders of the coup will be tried by their peers. Military and not civil justice will prevail. Many of the men involved in the takeover of the Cortes have already been released. The ringleaders are held in conditions befitting officers of their rank. General Milan del Bosch has a suite of rooms at a military establishment near Madrid. And Colonel Tejero, despite the fact that this is his second attempt to overthrow the state, is still allowed contact with his friends and military colleagues. So why doesn't the government of Spain seize this opportunity to purge the armed forces of their extreme elements? Juan Pablo Fusi has been one of the king's political advisors.
Strong action against the army would open such strong difference between the politicians and the army that possibly that could ruin in the long term the democratic process. That is, that we still would go back to a situation in which the divorce between the army and democracy would lead to a situation of hostility, of confrontation between democracy and the army, and that obviously no democratic regime could survive for very long, having the armed forces against it.
Is democracy in Spain still too weak to take on the army? Is that what you're saying?
I think it is very vulnerable, and is an obvious fragility in the Spanish democracy. It takes a long time to create an army which is loyal to democracy, which is identified with this present regime. You need still a couple of generations until we have an army which is either identified or reconciled or considers democracy as a natural regime for Spain.
The indications are that any change will be fought every inch of the way by officers who look with something approaching religious fervour on their past military glories and who admire modern displays of strength, such as the recent coup by the generals in Turkey. Officers who actively support democracy are ostracized. In 1976, Major Otero was one of the leaders of an association of democratic officers. He and 8 colleagues were thrown out of the army after pressures from other officers who hold different views.
You
mean, of course, the extreme right. And when extreme right, I mean not only the people who would violently try to take over the government, but the other sector who would back it. I think they account for about 30% of today's soldiers. I believe that a lot more people should be detained after this attempted coup, and a lot of high posts in the army ought to be changed also if we are to keep our democracy. There are people plotting a new coup, and this could be much more dangerous since they will invariably correct their mistakes. History has taught us that after one attempted coup, another invariably follows.
Do you believe that you'll ever be able to go back to the army?
Certainly. If I get the opportunity to do so, I will. And not because of any stupid sentimental involvement, but I believe that our army needs democratically minded soldiers. There were only 9 of us who were kicked out of the army. But if we were to go back to the army, it would mean that at last the Spanish army is becoming democratized.
Major Otero's most recent application for reinstatement was refused at the beginning of this month, a week after the army was supposedly brought to heel by the king. Democratic politicians in Spain are becoming increasingly aware that the failure of the coup in no way removes the threat of military intervention. It merely postpones it until the time is right for them to move again. Already in Spain, people are arguing about when the next attempt will be made. What most people agree on is that next time the tanks will surround the royal palace first. But even if the military shadow on democracy could be removed, there are other elements of the Spanish establishment which pose a threat. That's the view of Socialist Deputy Xavier Solana.
I am not sure that democracy is completely safe in Spain now. What happened the night of the 23rd of February, I think is a very, very important event that it tells us that there are important places in the state institution that are still with people that do not believe in democracy. People that have not accepted that Spain has changed, and they are still completely looking back instead of looking forward. I'm not just talking about people in the army, I'm talking about people in the civil service, I'm talking about people in the judiciary, I'm talking about people just about everywhere.
Those disciples of the old order look out from their ministries and courtrooms and are horrified by what they see as the new Spain. They believe that liberalism equals abuse, that the old values are being swamped in a wave of street crime and pornography. Certainly robbery and mugging is on the increase, and in central Madrid, magazines that would never have been tolerated in Franco's day are freely available. Doormen at sex clubs now openly tout for customers with the promise of once forbidden pleasures.
Show, street, discotheque, señorita, friquitron, very good. Muy bien. 500, whisky incluido. Finito, 4 de la mañana. Now dancing, discotheque, señorita, foki, very good. Muy bien,
But you have the police outside?
No, the police ni problemas. The police es por Radio Madrid. Hola, tenemos el paso ahora de espectáculo. Muy bonito,
The police are now on the streets in force to curb not the excesses of freedom, but the ambitions of traitors. They're guarding public buildings and broadcasting centres. They see their once unquestioned freedom to clean up Spanish society declining, much to the disgust of traditionalists like General Prieto.
Ahora estamos más avanzados que en el SOG de Londres para ver mujeres.
No doubt we can now see as many naked ladies in Spain as you can in London, but our wives can no longer go on the street at night without fear of being raped.
Other changes that have come with democracy are undoubtedly far-reaching and complex. They've literally been a shock to the system. And now Spain is faced with a choice: to support political and social freedom, warts and all, or to retreat to a society that's ordered by military statute. Both courses have their advocates in another area of Spanish democratic freedom, the press. In Madrid, there's a newspaper called El País, The Nation, an independent daily with the biggest circulation in all Spain. Launched just 4 years ago, it's as young as democracy itself. Its editor, Juan Cebrian, believes that however seductive the military option might be to men like Tejero and Milán del Bosch, it could no longer provide a solution to Spain's problems.
It's not so difficult to succeed with a takeover. The problem is what happened after. I personally don't feel that the Tejero and Milán del Bosch and the other generals had a clear idea about what they thought to do with the country after the takeover. I mean, I don't think it's possible to have a regime like in Chile or Argentina. Spain is not a banana republic, and it's a very complex society, very complex industrial society. And it's not possible to rule this society with the simplicity of mind of Tejero.
For the moment, El País is free from the restrictions that colonels and generals might impose, free to publish its liberal viewpoint, free except that the night we were there one of its political correspondents was beaten up by right-wing thugs. But if the democratic principle is still being fought over on the streets of Madrid, is the argument as keen off the beaten track of Spanish political life? 100 miles north of Madrid is the provincial capital of Avila. The character of this small community is in its skyline. Its battlements a reminder of a glorious military past. Avila, some say, is the finest walled city in Europe. On the towers, ragged twig top hats, nests for the stork that have come here without fail as long as anyone remembers. Perhaps it was in a place like this that Franco's deputy, Admiral Tejero Blanco, came to the conclusion that to offer change to a Spaniard was as bad as offering drink to a confirmed alcoholic. And above it all, the Catholic faith in stone, the spires and domes of the city's religious and monastic life. Modern Avila is tucked away over the hill. Its biggest employer, the commercial vehicle plant of Motor Iberica, dominating its scruffy trading estate in much the same way that the cathedral towers over the city square. When this sleepy, rather dusty town heard the news of the attempted coup, a local communist official packed his bags and left town. The wife of a member of the Socialist Party burned all his papers as a safety precaution. A veteran of Franco's Blue Division, who'd fought under Milan del Bosch on the Russian front, oiled his service revolver, this time to defend the cause of democracy. On the night 1 million people took to the streets of Madrid, a crowd of 2,000 marched through Avila. Most people did nothing. Political apathy is central to the course of Spanish history. It's said that in the later years of the Franco regime, there was no need to wield the instruments of a totalitarian state, because apathy undermined any mass opposition. Now, perhaps such ambivalence is to be expected amongst the poorly educated workers of rural Spain, but here it extends to the professional classes as well. Angel Ferrero is a headmaster in Avila. Norberto Leque, a civil servant. They and their wives explain that the trouble with democracy is that it puts too many demands on them.
Prácticamente 24 horas de que el Estado nos lo daba todo.
Before, the state used to give everything. The state used to care about everything. Now suddenly the average citizen finds himself saddled with the responsibility that he has to be a clear, bright voice against, for example, terrorism, our biggest problem. In that sense, democracy hasn't had time to get assimilated in a normal, everyday life.
Yo, pues que todo está muchísimo más caro y que más difícil.
I have noticed that things are much more expensive, and I have also noticed that people have to take more active interest in social life, in political life in this country. Before, everything was done for you from above, and now you have to be the one who tries and does things. As far as freedom is concerned, the change hasn't been for the small man, for the average man, like a farmer, hasn't been that much. The average peasant, his life, well, it hasn't changed that much. The only change has been more noticeable or more noticed by intellectuals and people aspiring to high places in power.
On the one hand, these families wouldn't like to see a military takeover. They're critical of the army's role in the attempted coup. But on the other hand, they're worried about terrorist violence, and so they have a certain sympathy for the generals who believe they must meet force with force.
Entonces, hay un atenuante, que hay un patriotismo.
Here we have to differentiate between terrorists and these military people who tried to carry out this coup d'etat. Okay, they were mistaken, but at least they had a higher ideal. They were doing this because they thought that the country was in some sort of danger. Now, if we have given amnesty
to terrorists, why shouldn't we give amnesty to these military men who mistakenly, yes, too subjectively, yes, tried to change the course of things?
When the straitjacket of authoritarian rule was taken off, violence in Spain was bound to increase. It came as no surprise when ETA in the Basque country stepped up its campaign of assassination. What has perhaps worried the people of Avila more is that the violence can be seen closer to home. 2 pupils at Angel Ferraro's school were expelled last year for making bombs in the school chemistry laboratory. Street corners carried the threatening graffiti of extreme politics, right and left. As in England, there's evidence that young people frustrated by pressures of unemployment or lack of opportunity are willing conscripts to the forces of right-wing extremism. Faced with so much change, the older generation looks for reassurance to the traditional pillars of Spanish society. The most profound of all influences on Spanish life is the church. Franco believed he was fighting a holy war. The Roman Catholic Church gave him unqualified support and was rewarded in turn with a confirmed place at the top table of the Spanish state. Democracy has eroded that relationship, and there are undoubtedly sections of the hierarchy that would support military action again to restore it. But even those parts of the church closer to the people have serious reservations about the effect of democratic change. Father Thomas Martinez is a member of the Dominican order in Avila.
The church is a little afraid that freedom will be abused by some people who think that freedom is the right to do anything they want, and that's very dangerous. So the church can't help being a little afraid of giving too much freedom to people who are not ready to use it the proper way.
Do you not think that the church would have preferred the attempted coup we saw a few days ago to have been successful?
No, I don't think so. We all regarded this coup d'etat as something, I may say, stupid. Because there's no going back. And we shouldn't go back. We all believe that.
Even if it means the church is less powerful?
The church has to give up some of the powers it had before, because they were not powers of a church. They were powers which were derived, to a certain extent, from privileges that had nothing to do with the work of the church, which is the teaching of Christ in matters of faith and morals. That's her work. Beyond that, the church has to follow the government and obey the government just as any ordinary citizen.
Does the church have to support democracy?
It has to, because, at least for us, Dominicans, we have St. Thomas Aquinas as our guide. And St. Thomas proposes this question: which is the best form of government? Answer: the form of government that better suits the people who are going to be governed. So, St. Thomas is not attached to any form of government. Neither are we. But St. Thomas says that the military make very bad governors. The military are not trained to govern, only for a short time until the danger passes over.
All the extremists of the army say they want is to be allowed to rule for a short time. But the erosion of ecclesiastical power in Spain is, of course, not entirely the result of democracy. As the nature of the Spanish economy changed from a simple agriculture to sophisticated industrial technology, a new materialism drove a wedge between many of the faithful and their church. Spain, in common with other European countries, suffers from high unemployment. 1.5 million are out of work, 22% of the population in the worst areas. Inflation is running at more than 15%. Workers on the industrial estate in Avila made it clear that even though they have new trade union freedoms, they're worse off than in Franco's day.
Fueran como en condiciones
debería marchar mejor.
We would certainly support democracy if we saw the things were much better. That's to say, we had a more efficient type of democracy, we would be more ready to act more actively for it. But so far, we are disappointed about it.
When you saw the news of the attempted coup on television or heard it on the radio, did you think that here was perhaps a new administration who would come and sort out the problems?
Pues sí, por un lado sí. Por un lado sí que lo pensamos, que luego a lo mejor ellos hubiesen visto.
Yes, I thought that at least I saw that things were taking a different turn, and maybe we would get out of this inactivity and this inefficiency. The only thing I'm not sure about is who knows if we were going to be better or worse off under this possible military government. I'm just a worker who, after leaving his job, goes back home and wants to enjoy a tranquil home. Now, myself, I think that yes, I would support a military government if this military government would give me back that tranquility I used to have.
Those men, and millions of workers like them, have seen the economic crisis deepen in the 4 years since Spain's democratic experiment began. So perhaps it's only natural that, in their eyes, democracy should take the blame. Socialist deputy Xavier Solana believes they're quite wrong.
Spain is a very unlucky country. In the last 100 years, we have lived a very short period of democratic life. One during the Republic in until 36, in which also the international economic crisis came along. Now, 40 years later, 45 years later, we open another window of hope, of democratic life in Spain, and again, the international economic crisis comes along. So the temptation of saying that the democratic process is the cause of unemployment, etc., of course they exist in people. It is used by the extreme right.
The isolated Spain of Franco survived behind its trade barriers. But today, such a policy would be impossible, in the view of Ferrer Salat, the chairman of the Spanish equivalent of the CBI.
The fact is that during the 60s, they were the most glorious days of the development, of economic development, that coincide with the dictatorship. But business and family business, I think they prefer really a market economy, and they prefer the free enterprise system. And of course, they are aware of the difficulties, for instance, from the labor point of view. But we have always defended, in fact, a free enterprise system. And it is not possible to have a really free enterprise system without democracy.
Do you believe that the other countries in the European community are worried now that Spain may not be able to hold on to its democracy, may not be able to make its democracy work?
Yes, I think so. I am sure that if Spain becomes a member of the common market, democracy would be much more consolidated in Spain. And as far as now, the negotiators from the common market, they are making and putting very difficult requirements for our entry. And they are delaying, in fact, adequate negotiations for the Spanish entry. So perhaps they are worried about the Spanish weakness in that sense.
A weak Spanish economy, still reliant in many regions on subsistence agriculture, is not attractive to European politicians, who already have more than enough problems with agricultural subsidy. But any suggestion of Spanish weakness in the field of political freedom is an even more serious barrier to EEC membership. It's already kept Spain on the outside once. In 1962, the community refused to accept the country ruled by Franco. But how can today's Spain convince its neighbours that the government is strong enough to resist the overthrow of democracy? Xavier Solana's opposition Socialist Party argues that the only answer is a national government of coalition.
I mean, in Europe, everywhere in Europe, knows of this type of government that takes place. After the war, practically everywhere in Europe. All the Democrats got together in order to build a new country, build a new democracy, etc. That's practically the situation in we are now. And I think will be suicide not to sum up forces, democratic forces, in order to construct Spain free, more just, democratic.
So far, Spain's ruling party, the Centre Democratic Union, has consistently refused such overtures of coalition from its political opposition. It pins its hopes on strengthening its own leadership under the new Prime Minister Calvo Sotelo. It'll be no easy task for this single centre party to overcome the economic and social problems that have coincided with democracy. But it'll be harder still to find a solution to Spain's greatest dilemma, the question of autonomy. Regions as diverse as poor Baden Andalusia and industrial Catalonia are determined to release the grip of Spain's central administration. If their wish is granted, Spain could become a loose confederation of as many as 12 autonomous states with parliaments of their own. The army and many sections of the Spanish establishment believe such a course would be disastrous. This conflict is the most serious threat to Spanish democracy, and nowhere is this conflict more clearly in focus than in the Basque Country. The king, who alone held the army at bay in Madrid, couldn't even make himself heard in the Basque town of Guernica. He paid his first visit to this town, which symbolizes the opposition to Franco during the Civil War, shortly before the coup attempt. He was shouted down by a crowd of Basque nationalist supporters. These people, deeply committed to autonomy, are so convinced of the justice of their case that they're prepared to clash head-on with the Spanish state, however disastrous that might be for the democratic unity that the country so obviously needs. One Pablo Fusi, who wrote the king's unheard Guernica speech, is certain that Basque terrorism and civil disobedience in the province were the factors that pushed the army into trying to seize power.
The Basque problem has conditioned, in a way, the whole democratic process, the whole transition process in the last 5 years. The terrorism in the Basque country, particularly terrorism against policemen and against army officers by both branches of ETA, have obviously created the sort of climate in which the army thinks that democracy is very weak to deal with terrorism, and to create a climate in which the army could think is the right moment for them to intervene.
The army is convinced that nothing short of separation from Spain will satisfy the militant Basques. After all, they already have their own elected assembly under the devolution plans introduced by former Prime Minister Adolfo Suarez. But in the view even of members of the moderate Basque Nationalist Party, PNV, full autonomy is being unnecessarily delayed. Ramon de la Sota is the Basque representative in the Madrid Senate.
We have been going at it very slowly. We have been pressurizing because the whole development of the autonomy has taken 6 years and we're still not even halfway there. So we have done it very slowly, and we are pushing because we know that the Spanish government is extremely and profoundly inefficient. We do believe that the greatest talent in Madrid is organizing disorder, administrative chaos, and simple and sheer inefficiency. The basic problem in Spain is the lack of government. No one has been governing these last few years. The army, I think, also wants a government to govern. We are ready to govern in the Basque country. We must be allowed to do so, and I don't think the army would object to that.
Can Spain really work as a loose federation of 11 or 12 autonomous regions?
Well, let's say that when Spain hasn't worked is when Spain has been a centralized state. When Spain was a glorious empire, Spain was composed of a series of peoples, and Spain as such didn't exist. It was always referred to as the Spains in plural. The disaster of Spain, the Spain that does not work, is a 19th century Spain. And I think the army, if they want to become or re-become what the Spanish army used to be in bygone days, they have to re-accept the notion of a loosely federated Spain, a Spain of peoples, a Spain of nations, a Spain of nationalities.
while most Basques would still support the aims of devolution. ETA, the separatist group that believes it will only achieve real independence by the use of the gun, is losing public support. In the Basque country, as in the rest of Spain, ordinary men and women have grown tired of violence in the streets. When last weekend, ETA's latest victim, Bilbao Police Commissioner Jose Raimundo, was given a military funeral in the town, the mood of the crowd was summed up in the shouts of opposition to the ETA assassins. The political voice of the militants in the Basque country is a party called Herri Batasuna. Their leader in Bilbao is Francisco Latamendia. While formally dissociating his party from acts of murder, he admits that even as public support for the extremists fades, it will be difficult to stop the ETA killings.
I am not saying that we are defending this violence. Of course, Herri Batasuna is not an armed organization, but if we would want the disparition of this armed resistance, that is ETA, we wouldn't have the moral authority to ask ETA to stop until the moment that the aims of the Basque left, that is the right of self-determination, will arrive to the Basque country. That is the only answer I can give.
If ever there was a hope that the terrorists would put the cause of democracy in Spain first, then such sentiments and the mood created by last weekend's funeral proved that hope to be misplaced. Faced with such provocation, the temptation among politicians and army officers in Madrid must be further military intervention. But moderate Basque nationalists like Ramon de la Sota believe that would be just the wrong thing to do.
We've been saying for years what has to be done to stop terrorism in the Basque country. And we want violence in the Basque country, come where it may, from the right or from the left, we want it to stop. We've been saying for years how it must be done. We need a strong statute of autonomy. We need a strong Basque government to start governing and start taking decisions. We need our own control of taxes and our own police force. And slowly, by showing that by talking and negotiating with Madrid, and through democratic means, the Basques can regain their historic autonomous rights. By the sheer doing of that, we shall be forcing violence into the sidelines and gradually eliminating it. But it is a slow process and a difficult and very painful process, but it is the only process. Other processes, such as the Tejero attempt, will only be counterproductive in the Basque country.
The new Prime Minister, Calvo Sotelo, even after the latest ETA murder, has publicly committed himself to pressing ahead with autonomy in all the regions of Spain, whether the army likes it or not. But within his own party, there are deputies like Manuel Ruperez, who feel the government has handled the autonomy issue badly and must now take stock before confirming any long-term policy.
I think that process of autonomous government was led sometimes with lack of perspective, lack of purpose, lack of clearly defined objectives. And sometimes some of those processes got out of hand. We have to rationalize that process. We have to think over it in terms of keeping both in political and administrative terms the unity of the country, and most probably that I wouldn't say that it is going to have setback, but we'll have to think over it, all of us together, to rationalize it.
And perhaps reduce the number of autonomous regions or slow down the whole process?
Well, I don't think it's a question of reducing the number of autonomous regions. Perhaps it would be a question of slowing it down.
Whilst those suggestions of caution may bring some comfort to the sections of the Spanish establishment who believe that devolution is the road to disintegration, they can only serve to further the aims of the extremists in the Basque province. Francisco Latamendia of Herri Batasuna, ambivalent about the use of violence as a political weapon, says any prevarication on the part of Madrid politicians is bound to be dangerous.
We don't like the situation of violence, of death, and we want that disappear. But it is necessary that our national situation will be recognized. We are a nation, that is very clear. In the last elections, more than the 2/3 of the Basques have voted for nationalist parties. The Spanish parties have had less than a third part of the voters. And since we are a nation, we want to have the ways of peacefully and institutionally arrive to be able to express our wills. So this situation of instability will last till the moment that our situation, our national situation, will be recognized.
What must be recognized in Spain is that 4 years after the first flowering of the country's new democracy, it's now in the throes of its most dangerous crisis. The arrest of the officers responsible for the occupation of the Cortes on the 23rd of February marked the beginning and not the end of that crisis. The king and his new prime minister are prisoners of the forces in Spanish society that still see the barrel of a gun as the instrument of political change, whether that gun is held in the hands of a terrorist or a military man like Antonio Tejero. At the funeral of Police Commissioner José Raimundo, the Guardia Civil, 2 weeks earlier the potential destroyers of democracy, for years regarded by the Basques as an oppressive army of occupation, were greeted as heroes. Crowds outside the church struggled to shake them by the hand. Nuns gave them their blessing, and the chant was "Long live liberty, long live Tejero."
¡Viva Tejero! ¡Viva Tejero!
File on 4 was produced in Manchester by Brian Phelan and edited by Colin Adams. And you can hear the next programme in this series at 8:45, that's next Wednesday evening.